Well, the lives of the African American soldiers who served at the Clay County military installation of Camp Landing are the focus of a new outreach effort by the Post's historians. Here to tell us about it is George Cressman Jr., staff historian for the Camp Landing Museum. George, good morning. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
So, you are trying to uncover some history from the World War II era. But first of all, for people who are maybe not familiar with Camp Landing's role in that war, in that effort, remind us a little bit about the history of the post, what purpose it served, who went through there, who was detained there. Tell us a little bit about the history.
Okay, so Camp Landing came into being in the summer of 1939 as the primary training site for the Florida National Guard. And then in the summer of 1940, the post was taken by the War Department as part of the new mobilization camps. And it was set up to train infantry soldiers. And during the war, we trained over 850,000 men at Camp Landing. So in addition to the training that happened there, we had 2 prisoner of war compounds, and the post administered 21 subposts all over the state of Florida with German prisoners of war in it.
So, a huge amount of people coming through that facility. And this was World War II, is a time when the Jim Crow South, it was very much alive and well with all of the restrictions that that imposed on segregation and the lives of the people that lived here. So, first of all, what do we know about anybody that was going through that camp as a service member, someone in training that was not a white service member?
Okay, so I think it's important to put in perspective. Until 1948, all the U.S.'s armed forces were strictly segregated. So during the training period, the infantry soldiers that were trained were primarily white, almost universally white. So we had two types of African Americans that came through Camp Landing. The first was in units, and we've identified 17 units that trained at Camp Landing during the war. And then there was
That were African American?
that were African American. Yes,
Okay.
yes. White units. There were over 160 white units that came through the post. The other group of African Americans that were at Camp Landing were in the service segments. So they were called Station Complement. There was a quartermaster detachment, and there was a service detachment. So the quartermaster detachment was responsible for providing supplies, goods, supporting the training effort. And the service detachment was responsible for keeping the post running. Now, the challenge with this is that the segregation that was going on in all of the armed forces, the African American units, African American soldiers, had a separate quarters section. They had a separate service club, a separate movie theater. They were completely segregated from the post. There was a lake on post that the white soldiers used. There was a lake on post that the African American soldiers used. So the challenge we have is that for the units, we can identify to some extent in the National Archives, we can identify some of the characteristics of those units and some of their history. But for the service and quartermaster detachments, there is nothing in the National Guards, in the National Archives. And what we'd really like to know more about is what's going on in the lives of these soldiers, both on the units that were trained and on the in the service and quartermaster detachments.
And that is the focus of your current outreach and your appeal to people to try to generate some interest, some awareness, and hopefully some stories, photographs, and documents of those service members. But I do want to ask you to tell us a little bit about the units that we do know something about. There is a archival history. There are some amazing photographs, and there are a couple of units in particular that have a really great story to tell, including one that served in Alaska. Can you tell us a little bit about what that unit was, who they were, and what they did?
So that was an African American engineer service company. They were responsible for building a portion of the Alcan Highway. And it's a really interesting story. Initially, they went up there. There were white units, engineer units that were working in the area. they were issued all of the power equipment. The African American unit initially was not issued power equipment. They were issued shovels and picks and axes, saws, and those sorts of things. And they were actually building more highway by hand than the white units that had power equipment. And so after a while, it became obvious we need to give these folks more power equipment to increase their efficiency.
And I just want to pause you because when you say the Alcan Highway, that is an abbreviation for a highway that connected part of Canada to Alaska.
So the Alaska Canadian Highway, there was a concern early on that the Japanese would take Alaska and cut off access to the lower 48. So this highway was built specifically to provide access to Alaska should the Japanese try to take Alaska.
And so we have some photos of that for people who are watching our live stream and they can see, but describe for us what kind of conditions people are working in, especially if they're working with hand tools and hatchets as opposed to power tools, but just the terrain, the temperature, what were they working around?
So the terrain is hilly. It's a lot of clay. There's a significant amount of stone that has to be moved. Forests are very heavy. The timber has to be cut and removed. Then, of course, you have the weather, and throughout the history of the Alcan Highway, keeping it open during the winter months is a huge problem.
This was one unit that was connected to Camp Landing and the officers, and excuse me, and the soldiers that trained there. But there was another unit that was in Southeast Asia doing similar work, also pretty difficult conditions. Tell us a little bit about that effort.
So this is a unit that worked on what was called the Lido Road, and the Lido Road runs through Burma, and it was an attempt to it was used to keep supplies moving into areas of India that had been captured by the Japanese. And so again, this is a rough, more jungle-like environment that they're working through. A lot of ravines that required bridges to cross, a lot of dams that had to be built in order to avoid the roads being washed out.
And some of the images that we're showing are just extraordinary because it shows these elaborate switchbacks that are trying to avoid erosion. So you have a road that might be just a quarter of a mile long, but it probably is 2 miles long in terms of its actual length. Yeah.
Sure.
And so it's amazing stories that, come from Camp Landing and that you all are collecting. What do we know without, as you're looking for additional information for these people who worked as in a service capacity, what do we know about the work that they did, who they were, where they came from?
So we have a limited number of names that we have been able to identify, and as I dig through the background on these men, they're coming from across the U.S. So there's the usual mix that you might expect to find in a military unit. We've got folks from Ohio, some from New York, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, the more southern states, and even a few that come from the far west. So there's a broad mix. Generally, these people are the soldiers that we've identified are coming from lower levels of educational background, and so there's an issue with being able to read and write and those kinds of things. So generally, these soldiers were doing manual labor kinds of things, building facilities at the post. On the quartermaster side, there was a huge set of warehouses that were serviced by rail cars, and so unloading rail cars and dispersing goods across the post. Food supplies, food was distributed daily to the various mess halls. Many of these African American soldiers worked in that food distribution.
And what is it that you think that knowing more about their story, learning more about their story or getting photographs or contacting family members, what do you think that will help flesh out in terms of the information that you have at the museum?
So what we'd really like to be able to do is we have a small display today of African American troops serving at Camp Blanding, and more broadly across the U.S. Army. We'd really like this display to become much more Camp Blanding centric, much more focused on what happened there. And so, having the ability to pick up some stories for what life was like. We have a story of a white soldier talking about living at the post. I'd like an analog for an African American
Mm.
soldier, and life was clearly not easy for these African American soldiers. We need to highlight that. This is a poorly documented area.
And I do just want to briefly note there was a visit to Camp Landing from a brigadier general, also a black man, a graduate of West Point. Just tell us a little bit about him and what that visit meant, just briefly.
So this is General Benjamin Davis. Benjamin Davis was the first African American who graduated from West Point. At the start of the war, he was a brigadier general, one-star general, and he was asked by George Marshall to begin touring the various training facilities across the United States and drawing some conclusions about what life was like for the African Americans. So General Davis visited Camp Blanding in March of 1942, and from that visit, the preparation for that visit, we have some identification of soldiers who were at the site. We have identification of the women who ran the service club, and were able to build a little bit of lifestyle for these folks. Unfortunately, we've not found any of their descendants or their relatives at this point.
Well, it is a fascinating history. George Cressman, thank you so much for sharing it with us today. Thanks for being here.
You're most welcome. Appreciate the opportunity.
I should say, if people want to contact you or send information, where do they go?
So our website is info at campblandingmuseum.org.
Okay, very good. George Cressman.